Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about a very important topic that every app developer should know. It's localization. And today I'll be explaining this using Flutter as the app platform. The localization framework will not only let you reach a huge number of customer base, but also will make it easy for every geographical user. So let's begin. Here I will start with just creating a normal Flutter app. Let's give it a name of Flutter app local or localization, whatever you want to give the name to. And then let's just start the project. So first thing that will be given to you once you open your Android Studio or any IDE is basically of already developed application on already like a boilerplate. Flutter basically gives you a counter-based application where you can just click a button and increase the counter. I'm going to start a iOS simulator so that I can start showing you parallelly as I work. So let the iOS simulator boot up. Meanwhile, we'll start working on the project. So first thing that we need to do is we need to add support of localization. In order to do that, we'll go to pubspec.yaml file and then we'll add certain support libraries here. So first thing that we need to provide is Flutter localization. Uh, Before we uh, start fetching the packages, we just need to add one more thing, which is provider. I will explain that in detail once I reach at that stage of the tutorial. So these are the two packages that we'll be using in this tutorial. Let's click pubget to get all the packages. Now, first thing that we need to do here is we need to start adding the support of internationalization. Android Studio out of the box give you support for that. You just need to go on the tools menu, go to Flutter Intel, and then click on initialize for the project. So once you do that, you will notice some auto-generated file and folder will come here. The folders are generated, which basically contains all the delegate function that is required to support the localization, the delegate function itself, and the ARB files. I just want to take a minute and explain what are the ARB files. These are like just JSON files which actually contain key value pairs of all your languages. So for example, if I go here, you can see there's just a sample piece which contains like a JSON object. Let's say we want to add maybe a welcome text, let's say, and we'll give it a value of hi, welcome, or whatever you want to do. So this is your English ARB file. So wherever you use this welcome text, you will see hi, welcome. What we would want to do is we'll have support for other languages also, or so-called other locale. In order to do that, what we'll do is we'll go to tools, Flutter Intel, and then we'll click on the add locale button. Now this actually will create all the boilerplate code that is required to complete this. So for example, let's say I want to I want to basically add a support of Hindi language. So I just enter HI and click OK. As soon as I do that, you'll see there is one more file here, which is intl underscore hi.arp, which is similar to English. What we just need to do is we need to copy this, go to Hindi, and we'll paste it here. Now, the key remains the same. The value will change. The value will change based on the language. So what I will do is I will just copy this and I will go to Google Translate and then I'll paste it here and I will get the Hindi version of this and I'll copy this. Now what will I do is simply will paste it here. So now we have two languages support that we have added in our code base. Now how to check this? Now in order to check this, or we have just added the support. Now we'll click on get dependencies of pubspec so that when we start adding delegate here, it won't create an issue. So in order to achieve this, what we are going to do is we are going to add a support of multiple languages by adding delegates. So in order to add delegates, I'm just going to copy paste a small piece of code here, which is going to help us achieve that. So if I go here and paste here, so this is what is required to complete. These are just the delegate that is required to achieve. I'm going to import the libraries that is required and the delegate itself. Now, as soon as I am done with this, I am basically having a support of multi-language, or I can say Flutter localization. There is one thing that I want to bring into notice is basically your material app has a property called locale. Now, what locale will allow you to do is you can change the locale itself directly from here. So if I want to add support of Hindi language, just by adding that line, I am able to support Hindi languages as well. Now, the piece of code that I pasted here is basically required so that you can use your language support throughout the widget anywhere in the hierarchy. You can just access that from there. Now, if I just pasted a hi here, or I mean, I'm just changing the locale here, this locale will let you change the language. Now, the second step to this is basically showing the text itself. Now, in order to show the text, what we will do is we'll go below and we'll just add a text here. Remember that this is a boilerplate code provided by the Flutter community itself. So what I'll do is I have a delegate called S, and then I will access that, and I will go to this, and then I'll access this. Now, as you can see that I have access to a string called welcome text. This is the same text that I have added in my ARB file. So this is how you will access those variables. Remember, welcome text remains same for both the files. Welcome text remains the same in the English file and in the Hindi file as well. That means whenever you start accessing that piece of text, this welcome text will basically fetch those text values based on the locale selected. And currently the locale that we have selected is Hindi, which I have mentioned here. So this actually completes your entire code, and you actually have support of Hindi, and based on whatever language you want to add, you can add as many languages as you want. So once this is done, we are done with the localization. Now we will move to the second part and the most important part of this tutorial, which is giving a dynamic support of localization. Means everyone would want to have sort of maybe a drop down or any selection based on which you want your user to change the language. Now, in order to do that, what I will do is I will basically create two buttons, Hindi and English, and whatever you select based on that, programmatically in real time, the language will change. Now, it's very important to understand that we just need to change this locale value. How will we do that? So in order to do that, we will basically use a concept called notifier, change notifier. Remember that this is at the top hierarchy. You are just at the top hierarchy. So you need to wrap this entire application in sort of a provider which will give you access to those changes. So Flutter give you a class called change notifier, and using change notifier, you can notify all the widgets who is registered of listening. Remember, it's very important that it has to be registered for listening, and we'll have to do that manually. This is very important because once you wrap your entire project into a change notifier provider, any change that happens which will be triggered by a user action will be notified to the hierarchy or the widget which is basically under the hierarchy, but that widget has to manually register himself in order to get those information. So before we do that, we will actually create a class. That class will actually let us store the value of locale, and a sort of a getter which will actually we will use at the later point of time. So let's just create a class, or maybe a dot file, which we will call language change provider. That's called a class here, language change provider. Now we are going to implement this or extend change notifier here. Now this is where the entire magic happens. Now, what is happening here is we are basically creating a class. Let me just quickly correct the spelling mistake. Okay. Now, what we're doing here is we are creating a class which is extending change notifier. This change notifier will basically be used in the main dart file where we will wrap it with a provider which we added at the initial stage of the video in the pubspec.yaml file. That provider is going to provide that change to the app. So first thing that we'll need is a local, which would be a current local, we can say. That would be initial. Let's make English as our default language or local. Let me quickly correct this. Now, second thing that we need is we need a function which any widget can call for for them to able to change the locale. So let's call it change locale. We'll pass a string. That would be the basically the code HI or EN or whatever language you want to create with. Now in this we will change the value of current locale to new locale, and then we'll pass the received locale value here. Mm, Now this is done. This is actually completely done. One thing that we are left, which is the important part and I want to emphasize here, is a function called notify changes or notify listeners. I'm sorry, notify listeners. What this function is going to do is those widgets who registered themselves to listen to these changes, they will get all the changes done by other widgets. Remember how, just try to understand how it works. It's like a pub sub model where a widget will subscribe for certain changes, and if some other widget do the changes, the the changes will be published and that widget will receive those changes. This is going to help us a lot, and will be making us possible to make very performant app, because you are not building any widget, you are not lifting any states, you are not using any redux or stuff like that. You are basically creating a pub sub model and only link to those widgets that actually requires them. Okay, let's move back to the main file. First thing that we need to do is we need to wrap this up with a function. That function is basically going to provide everything here. So we will call it change notifier provider. Now this function basically let me just wrap this up, not like that. I will use a context action and use wrap with widget. Now I will change notifier provider. Now the important point is the change notifier provider takes two things. First, it needs to create a context or basically create a instance of that class. But before that, we need to also provide what kind of notifier provider we are giving. So we are basically giving the one that we created, language change provider. This this notifier is the type of notifier given by Flutter, and we're saying that we want to have our provider as basically the type of the ChangeNotifier provider. Now we are going to provide them a context and the instance of this language change provider, which should give me suggestion. I'm not sure that's not giving. Okay. Now, once this is done, what we are going to do is we are going to add a builder class just below that. It's giving me an error. It says it is expecting a comma, which we have given already. Actually, we missed this. Now, there is another important concept that I'm going to explain right now is basically the context here is the same context as this one. But what we need to do is we need to provide this material app its own context so that it can talk to its parent. Otherwise, this notifier won't be available in this context. Now, in order to achieve this, we'll just wrap it around a builder uh, a builder widget. Let's do that. Now, as soon as we do that, builder actually needs a builder function, which is basically this, and we'll give a context along, and this would be wrapped around this. Now we are done. We what basically did is, let me recap this everything. We did a lot of code. So let's try to understand this. We This is our app. We gave, or we actually wrapped inside a widget called builder. That builder is just providing a context to the parent, which is this one, so that the material app can access the provider. This change notifier provider is basically a class or a widget provided by Flutter team. What this does is it basically let you push the changes or the information that you want to share along with the widgets that has basically registered themselves for the changes. Now this is done. What next step that we need to do is we need to change this value. So how will we change this value? We'll just click provider dot off, and then we just need to tell the type, which is language, which is our language change provider, and then we will get the function called. We'll actually need to provide the context and then listen to true. I want you guys to focus a little bit here because important concept is basically being explained here. What we are trying to do is we are basically uh, telling the material app that, okay, this is the provider of this type. You need to listen to the changes. Remember, this is how we're saying that you need to listen to the changes being provided by this provider. Now, one thing that we missed here is we haven't provided a getter, because you can see that this is sort of an instance to that class, and then we need to have a getter here. Let's generate a getter for it. Go to getter, and then okay, now we have a getter called current locale. And now if we go back here and click current locale, now what is happening here is basically we are giving material app sort of a registration, which is basically a registration to this language change provider, and saying that you need to listen to the changes. Whenever there is a change in this value, the current locale value will be updated to locale. This is very important. So meanwhile, let's just complete the code first. Now we have the locale, which is going to be changed whenever there's an action, but the action is missing. Now, in order to achieve that action, we have already given a welcome text here. So in order to get this done, we'll just add two buttons here, which is elevated button. Let's just add two elevated buttons and define the functions here for this. And for this, we'll call text. Let's call it Hindi. And for this, let's call it English. Okay, cool. So now we have two buttons, which is basically going to solve our problem. So what is going to happen is whenever these button will be pressed, uh, the corresponding language will change. Now, how to do that? It's very simple. You just need to use this piece of code. You need to read the context, and then you need to basically define the type, which is our language change provider type. Let's do that. Language change provider, and then with this we have the basically the function to change locale. So this is the function that we created in the class. You must remember that. And for Hindi, we're just going to provide the keyword as Hindi, HI, which we initially added while adding locale. And then we'll similarly go to English, and we'll do English here. And we are done. This is the entire piece of code. that you need to create in order to support multi-language or localization in your application. So let's quickly review what we just did. We just created a provider. This provider is going to provide the state of our current locale that we want to have, which we initially defaulted to English. We also created a function so that any widget can access that and change the locale whenever required. And whenever somebody or the widget calls, basically you are also calling notify listeners. Now this notify listeners is going to notify to all the widget who have registered themselves to listen for the changes. This is very simple and straightforward. Now here, what we're doing is we are just having our material app and we are actually wrapping that up inside a provider, a notification provider or the change notifier provider. This change notifier provider is of type language change provider, which is basically our class. So this change provider basically going to provide the changes that is done in this class by any of the widget. And once that is once the change is done, it's going to propagate that change to whomsoever who is registered. For example, material app is registered for this by basically doing provided or off language change provider context listen true. This is important. So if you just want to do it once, you can just make it false and then you can go ahead. But for this, you're just going to do listen true so that you're listening all the time, because user can change the language anytime. And then the current locale. So basically you are giving the value of locale to material app here. Now, who is triggering this? The trigger is happening at the end of it. Remember, we added two buttons. One is Hindi and other is English. So you can see the change locale high and in. So we're basically calling the function change locale, which is mentioned here, change locale. And then once we are calling that function, this is basically going to change the language. Once this is changed, and this is going to be notified. As soon as this is changed, this is going to notify to all the widget, and then all the languages will change. Now this coding is done. Now we need to do the demo. So let's try to get the iOS simulator on. Okay, guys, so we have our simulator up and running. Now, as you know that we have added two button, which is Hindi and English. Now, if you press Hindi, we will see that this thing changes. And if you press English, it will change back to English. Now, this is what you mean when you say dynamic Flutter localization. This is what you have to create. Now, I would also want to show you one small thing before we end this tutorial, which I actually wanted to show at the start of the tutorial, but let's do it now. So I could normally go ahead and change it to Hindi here. So if I press S, so you will see that as soon as I change the locale value to Hindi, it changes to Hindi itself. And if I want to change it to English, it changes to English itself. So it's very, very straightforward. The support is already there by material app widget. You just need to change the locale value by changing this. The entire notification provider thing that we have written is just to make it dynamic so that you can change this programmatically. So let's just get rid of this again. And yeah, so once this is done, we're pretty much here. So if you change it to Hindi, it's changed to Hindi, and then you go to English, you can change or you can add as many languages as you want, as I explained. So thank you so much, guys. I have also written a blog around it where all the source code is there. There is a link to GitHub in the description. You can just get all the code from there and then you can start working on it. Thank you so much.